Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We're continuing on the letter N for next. We've looked at the importance of continually growing and changing and reaching for what God has for us next. I want to read to you Genesis 8:22. While the earth remains, seed time, harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not cease. What we see is that God has established from the beginning, there's these seasons of continual change. Solomon echoes this: to everything there's a season, to every time for a purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck what is planted. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to there's a season for everything. In other words, seasons are always changing. Life stages are always changing. Seasons inside of a company. Economic seasons are always changing. Culture, technology. So change is the one constant that you really should just count on inside of your church, inside of your life, that you must always continually be changing. In fact, isn't that really the heart of Christianity? Jesus came to change us. And the new birth is about the ultimate change, and that we go from glory to glory. The righteous steps of a righteous man are ordered of the Lord. In other words, we're always taking steps. So if change should be a constant inside of us, that we're always evolving into what God has for us next, then why do we resist change? Why is it so many organizations don't change? Leaders don't change. Churches don't change. Why? Because we're creatures of habit. It's been once said that the only people that like change are babies with wet diapers. Outside of that, nobody really likes change because we're creatures of habit. So I want to unpack 4 reasons why we tend to be resistant to change, because you might find yourself limiting yourself with maybe one of these points. First of all, change just isn't comfortable. It takes work. It's easier to stay in the place of familiarity. You know, we hear that statement, well, this is how it's always been done. Well, in the good old days, is a familiar statement. But, when you really stop and think about it, when, older generations will say, well, the good old days, well, it's actually not as good as you thought it was, because statistically, there are a lot of things better today than there were back in, let's say, 1902. For example, in 1902, the average life expectancy was 47. Today is pushing like 87. So it's nearly doubled. I go, that's much better, especially since I'm over 47. Only 14% of homes had a bathtub. You've heard the saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, what that actually originated was when it was time for either the weekly bath or the monthly bath, depending on how wealthy you were. You always started with the oldest. So you would start with the oldest male. So grandpa, and not many families lived together, so you'd have a large family living inside of the same home. So grandpa would go first. Well, the bath water's not very clean. Then dad might go. Bath water's not clean. Once you go through all the men, then it's the women's turn. Grandma's going to go. The ladies are going to go. Then you get down to the kids. And then the last person in there was the baby. So the water was so dirty that you literally could lose the baby and throw the baby out with the bath water. So that's literally where that saying came about. So things are much better today. Only 8% of homes had a telephone. A 3-minute call from New York to Denver was $11, and that was in 1902 currency. There were only 8,000 cars in the U.S. and 144 miles of paved roads, and the maximum speed was 10 miles an hour. I would have lost my mind. I'd be in prison. I just wouldn't have made it. The average wage was 22 cents an hour. You'd have to save up to shop at the dollar store. And so the truth is, there are many things better today than there were back in the old days. So look, don't get so comfortable with the way things used to be, and maybe they were great, that you don't forget to embrace and seize what God is doing today. Back when the temple was being rebuilt, the young generation was shouting unto the Lord, but the older generation was weeping. And the reason they were weeping is because they remembered the glory of the past. And God said, stop weeping, because the glory of the second will be greater than the glory of the first. And there are times that we're just kind of crying over what we lost in the past, and God's saying, hey, I'm not done moving. I'm not done working. What's ahead is always better than what's behind. So don't forget that. Next, sometimes change brings fear of the unknown. Like when you just don't know what's out there and there's all the uncertainties of change, it's a little scary. And so a lot of people resist it. There was a letter written to President Andrew Jackson, sixth president of the United States, by a concerned politician. He wrote this: as you may know, Mr. President, railroad carriages are pulled at the enormous speed of 15 miles an hour by engines which, in addition to endangering life and the limb of passengers, roar and snort their way through the countryside, setting fire to crops, scaring livestock, frightening women and children. The Almighty certainly never intended that people should travel at such breakneck speeds. And it was written by Martin Van Buren, governor of New York, who later became the 8th president of the United States. Actually, Andrew Jackson might have been the 7th. I might have been wrong. But hey, give or take a foot, we're close. Human nature is to fear the unknown. We tend to criticize what we don't. And then here's what I see people all the time, especially in church space. Well, God Almighty never intended. Well, how do you know? I go, give me a Bible verse for that. And then give me 2 Bible verses, because Jesus said in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let everything be established. Look, if you're afraid of something, you're not familiar with something, quit throwing God and God Almighty never intended in there unless you have a bunch of Bible verses to back that up. I thank God that we didn't stop progress because people were afraid of railroad carriages going 15 miles an hour. I was in China in May, and I was going about 200 miles an hour on a train, and I go, that's a rush. Anyway, for others, change just brings the fear of having to learn the unknown. You know, people, you reach a certain state of life and you feel that your mental elasticity doesn't want to keep stretching and growing and learning. The philosopher Aristotle said years ago that the heavier an object, the faster it will fall to earth. Well, his theory went unchallenged for nearly 2,000 years. Then Galileo took a group of professors to the base of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped a 10-pound ball and a 10-pound weight and a 1-pound weight at the exact same time. Now, according to Aristotle's theory, the 10-pound weight should arrive and land first. However, both landed at the exact same time. In spite of the repeated experiments, in spite of the evidence, the so-called learned scholars sided with Aristotle because they didn't want to change what it was they learned. It was easier to just believe what I already believed than to relearn something new. Later, Galileo, when he was proving Copernicus's theory that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but that planets revolved around the sun, he was thrown into prison and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Why? Because there's always a generation of people who fear having to learn something new. Well, let that not be you and let that not be myself. Let us always be people continually moving forward to what God has next. See you in the next podcast.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.